I would like to invite Professor Jang Yun-jae of the EY Women's University to facilitate the webinar today. Professor Jang.
Okay, sisters and brothers in Christ, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to 2020 KIFE International Webinars on Discerning Transformative Ecumenism in a Pandemic-Stricken World. And this is today's speaker, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, and she will speak on this theme, exploring theologies of life and fostering partnerships among the vulnerable. And this is me. Don't be surprised that this picture is me 15 years ago when I was much younger than this. So call me Yun-jae. I teach theology at Ewha Women's University, which is world's largest women's university.
No, it's open then.
With 23,000 women, all women, and I enjoy my work. And I'm happy to be facilitator of this session. Okay, this is how we organize today. 10 minutes of a kind of introductory work, and Dr. Lewis will be given 25 minutes for her presentation, and then followed by my short response. And you have about 28 minutes of question and answers. And then a very short closing with announcements. This is how we are going to proceed today. Okay, I have prepared a special opening prayer. This is a prayer during times of COVID-19. And you know, this is by the United Church of Canada. Can we all together read this prayer together? All right. When we aren't sure, God, help us be calm. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. And when information comes
from
all
sides,
correct
and
not, help us to discern. When
fear makes it hard to breathe, and anxiety seems to be the order of the day.
Slow us down, God. Help us to reach out with our hearts when we can't touch our hands. Help us to be socially connected when we have to be socially distant.
help us to
love as perfectly as we can, knowing that perfect love casts out all fear. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Let me introduce the co-sponsors. Only the names of the co-sponsors, 3 of them. The Transformative Ecumenism Collective and the Korean Institute for Future Ecumenism, or KIFE. And lastly, WCRC, which is the World Communion of Reformed Churches. We are co-sponsoring this important webinar. Now, let me introduce the speaker of today, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis. The Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis is the chaplain and dean of the Manning Memorial Chapel at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. At the university, she co-chairs of the President's Anti-Racism Task Force. She is a practical theologian and hails from the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. Her academic training has taken place in the Caribbean, Canada, and the UK. A clergywoman, counselor, researcher, educator, and administrator with 4 decades of experience in ministry. She is experienced in pastoral counseling, spiritual care, spiritual direction, and the supervision of counselors in Christian and multi-faith contexts. Marjorie has provided counseling and spiritual direction for individuals and groups, developed training programs for pastoral counselors, as well as conducted research and collaborated with colleagues in developing targeted counseling interventions to meet emerging needs in the Caribbean and Canada. Okay. Prior to her current post, she served as a chaplain to hospitals in Nova Scotia and pursued advanced training in clinical pastoral education, or CPE. She has also worked in the area of theological education and the ministerial formation as a lecturer and president of the United Theological College of the West Indies. As a lifelong learner and researcher, she continues to track emerging trends in the disciplines of practical theology aimed at applying academic knowledge to fostering the well-being of individuals, families, and vulnerable groups in the society. Marjorie's work is informed by a commitment to cultural sensitivity and intersectionality in serving with persons of diverse groups, genders, social classes, sexual orientations, and ethnicities. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals and collaborated with others to edit and co-author publications. She currently participates in professional organizations and groups such as the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care, the World Council of Churches, Reference Group on Human Sexuality, the WCC's Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network, the Jamaica Council for Interfaith Fellowship, the Jamaica Women's Political Caucus, and Caribbean Women Theologians for Transformation. So please warmly welcome Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis when she speaks on this theme, exploring theologies of life and fostering partnerships among the vulnerable. Please, Dr. Marjorie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the colleagues who are here. I'm looking forward to our exchange as we go through our session today. And I see the person who I'm to blame for this, Hewitt, one Reverend Dr. Roderick Hewitt. Good to see you, Roderick. Mm-hmm. I start with my standpoint because coming out of feminist and womanist traditions, I think it's important to acknowledge that we are not all coming from the same place. It's not a bad thing. But traditionally in theology and in other academic disciplines, we have suffered from persons in dominant positions making their experience normative and excluding other perspectives. So I think it's important to share with you. So we can go to slide 2 now. Thank you. My standpoint is what I call nannish theology, and it's a work in progress. I was thinking about womanist theology and felt that the African-American womanist theology had some resonance with the Jamaican and Caribbean experience, but did not actually totally capture that experience. And as I mentioned, I felt that we need to start from the bottom, from where we are. So in beginning that reflection, sorry, some bits of which have been published, it seemed to me that our starting point in Jamaica was Nanny of the Maroons, who is the only national heroine of a group of 7, 6 men and 1 woman. Sorry. She's an ancestral icon, a warrior, and a mother of the community. And in my research and reflection, I felt that that was appropriate because women from different religions, including Muslim, Rastafari, cultural persons involved in culture and the arts, also recognized Nanny as what one writer called the quintessential Jamaican woman. So I liked the accessibility, that her reach was interfaith and ecumenical, and acknowledged among the people in different expressions, including as a national heroine. Now, the Maroons were freedom fighters in Jamaica. They're still there. The British captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655. People of my vintage, we had to learn this by rote. 1655 under Admiral Penn and General Venables. We were taught this by heart in primary school. So there were Africans in the country at the time under the Spanish occupation, and they went to the hills and engaged the British in sustained guerrilla warfare. Eventually, the British were forced to sign a peace treaty with the Maroons, and they have had internal self-government for some time. Now, there are areas that are contested, but what I will say this much, that Nanny was the female leader. So the leadership was male and female. And she was a cultural icon, a warrior, a healer, and an African priestess in many ways. So in my view, our biblical reference this understanding of womanhood was more analogous to Deborah, who worked with Barak in a way similar to the way that Nanny worked with her brothers and other male leaders to preserve the community. So this is the nomenclature that I think is appropriate for contextualized Jamaican womanist theology. And as I said, it's a work in progress. And I keep thinking about what does this mean and how does it become incarnated? So thank you. Next slide. My current context is very important. To your right, you will see something that looks like a cross with a crescent moon and a star. This is actually the symbol on the flag of the Mi'kmaq Council. I am living in Mi'kmahi, which is the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, the original indigenous people of this place. And that's a very important thing that we do at the beginning of presentations or functions, to acknowledge that the original people, and particularly the indigenous people for this specific area in which we live. So there is a relationship between the Mi'kmaq Council and the university that's really very important. But the acknowledgement also is important in recalling that there were treaties signed, so that everybody living in Canada, they will say we are treaty people, because land was not given away. Treaties were signed to establish the relationship between the indigenous and First Nations people and the European settlers. I am also as you see the beautiful chapel there on a snowy day. That's where I am now, in my office at the chapel. And as I mentioned just before we formally started this session, that I actually took up this post on the first Monday of March of this year. And in 2 weeks, the entire campus was closed because of the pandemic. So we had established with my predecessor, very, very wise man, very experienced chaplain, a nice, orderly, handover. We were going to take a month. He was going to show me the ropes. I was going to learn the campus. We would hang out and get to know the students. 2 weeks and it was over. And then I had to figure out how to function now in this context. The approach I took was one of continuity and new vision. Very, very fortunate that my predecessor agreed to be available to me to ask questions and for some guidance, because I believe very sincerely that we need to acknowledge the elders. We need to give them the respect that is their due, and also to learn from them. He was able to fill me in on what has happened, to teach me the community, to give me very, very good advice, and continues to support me at this time. He's now retired. So a large part of the work in the chapel traditionally was centered around the worship in the chapel. But the university wanted more work in terms of interfaith engagement, more openness to diversity, and other ways to develop other ways to work with groups on the campus and within the community who may not be specifically allied to a particular religion. So here we have Muslim students are formally organized, Jewish students are formally organized. We have a few Christian groups, Roman Catholic, InterVarsity, Chinese Christian Fellowship, and we have Hindus also, who, although are not in a formal group, certainly value their traditions, such as Diwali, which just started a few days ago. So the expectation is that I'll try to find a way to work with these students. We do have a different space for Muslim prayer on the campus as well. In seeking to develop this new vision and in the context of COVID-19, I thought it was important to begin a discussion about what spirituality was and what could be offered by the chapel. And I worked with other colleagues to develop an understanding of spirituality, not only confined to religious groups, but inclusive of the quest for meaning, for purpose, for identity, positive self-identity, and also to contribute, to make a difference in society. So that kind of framework was developed, shared on the websites, and in some workshops with groups of colleagues, students, and so on. An important part of the work of the chapel is a chapel choir. We have a treble choir, which is absolutely fantastic, and that has been an important strength of the chapel over the years and within the wider community. We have a Wolfville area interchurch council, and the chaplain traditionally sits on that council. That has been a very good space working with colleagues on a number of issues and providing collegial support in a structured as well as in informal ways. We are in Wolfville in a rural township, and we are surrounded by farms. So the university is a very important institution to the life of the town and to the livelihoods of many people within this small community. Okay, next slide. And so to our topic, more specifically, exploring theologies of life and fostering partnerships among the vulnerable. When COVID-19 hit, I wasn't thinking of constructing a systematic theology of COVID-19. I had to figure out, and I suspect this was the case for a number of people, given our existential situation and the kairos, what theology is relevant, what sustains, what inspires, what guides, what helps me to cope. So this is where I came from. And one of the issues for me was being able to name and embrace my own vulnerability. COVID-19 affects everybody, whether you are a leader or not. And I think for some of us as ministers, I think I can say that anecdotally from my conversations with other colleagues, we are just thrown into a totally different situation. How do we deal with having to do things online when you're not a techie? You know, it's very vulnerable. How do you minister to people whose relatives are dying in the hospital, who can't attend, who can't go to visit them, who can't attend funerals while you're dealing with that yourself? So a number of the things I think that we took for granted that were just routine for us as ministers left. And then the vulnerabilities before us, and how do we deal with that vulnerability. In addition to the general COVID-19 situation, I am what is called here, people who are not from the area in Nova Scotia, they say you're a come from away. So you have a certain level of vulnerability as a stranger. And I had just come into the community, so I hadn't settled into a congregation, made friends, you know, the normal things that you would do. And the strategy I had, because I've lived in a couple of countries, I've developed a strategy, one part of which usually is finding a congregation and joining the choir. But that couldn't happen because we were all now locked down. So even how one could negotiate normally entering into a new community, that was taken away. And then there is the intersectionality of being a Black woman, of being single, of dealing as someone of African descent with the added trauma of George Floyd, with some competency gaps, one of which I mentioned before, which is the technology is, you know, not my strong point. And also I was out of practice. I haven't had to preach every Sunday since the mid 1980s. And suddenly, come March 2020, I'm expected to come up with a service and a sermon every Sunday and sound at least vaguely intelligent. So there were a lot of adjustments that were being made. But in particular, the clinical training and work that I did as a practitioner of Ignatian spirituality provided some tools to look at the business of embracing this vulnerability and being in solidarity with other people who are vulnerable, not by a position of leadership, a stance of leadership, that suggests you are impervious, but to say this moment requires a facing of intergenerational trauma, which people of African descent, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups continue to struggle with then another layer of the complex grief and ongoing trauma of COVID-19. And on top of that, for people of African descent in particular, the visceral effect of the murder of George Floyd on all of us, because now it was not just simply the little annoyances of people following you around in the shops, or always being the random person pulled out of the line in the airport. I think a number of people on this call understand what I'm talking about. But now there is somebody who would put a foot on your neck, look into a camera, and snuff your life out while you say, "I can't breathe." So this has been, I think, a very, very powerful moment for a lot of us. But how do we cope with it? And for me, part of it was naming and embracing vulnerability and discovering some dimensions of the vulnerability that were not immediately obvious to me. For example, I really miss my pets. I didn't think, I knew I'd left a dog and 2 cats in Jamaica when I came this way, but it was something about the space of the lockdown of COVID-19 that it suddenly occurred to me, actually, I miss my pets. So next slide, thank you. The next question was asking who else is vulnerable. Who among family, friends, colleagues, strangers, neighbors, who else is vulnerable? In this context, students, and particularly international students, had particular levels of vulnerability. A number of students, even Canadian students, had to make some serious decisions and continue to have to make decisions about whether to go home for the holidays, because maybe they don't want to inadvertently give grandma or their parents. So people had to make painful decisions about Thanksgiving, for example, because Thanksgiving in Canada comes a little before Thanksgiving in the States. International students were not able to go home. So some who were planning to go home suddenly found there were no flights. They had no funds for accommodation, for food. So the university itself immediately set up a fund for students. And I'm proud to say the faculty and the staff were among the first to contribute. And within 2 weeks, they had contributed a significant sum. Subsequently, the Canadian government put in supports that benefited mainly Canadian students, but the international students were stranded. In some cases, their parents at home had lost their jobs, were not able to send funds. So this was a significant group. Black, Indigenous, and visible minorities, as they say here, also were important. And that includes people of Chinese descent, because there was a major kind of discussion. And I think some of you would be familiar with the ways in which anti-Chinese racism spiked in some cases in the wake of coronavirus. In Canada, they had bad memories about SARS because a similar thing had happened. So families, Chinese families who might have been Canadian for 3 generations, suddenly were being called SARS and those who had those memories had now, in a sense, been re-traumatized by that, and fears for their children coming up in a context where, again, China was associated, and all Chinese people blanketly associated by some others with blame for coronavirus. So we had those that happening, and the Black and the Indigenous. I won't even go into all of the permutations of that, but for all indications of poverty, reduced access to tertiary education, overrepresentation in prisons, these are all marks of the way in which racism plays itself out, particularly for Black and indigenous communities. So they were already vulnerable, and in all of North America, what became obvious is that coronavirus was hitting the groups that were already vulnerable in the society in greater proportions than those who were wealthy and were in the dominant groups. And then workers, especially workers in what they call the gig economy, who were hustling 2-3 jobs of whatever ethnicity, in some cases, even where there were government benefits. How do you qualify for some of these benefits related to work? So who are these people who are falling in between the cracks? And then migrant farm workers. In a community surrounded by farms with migrant farm workers. We tried as an ecumenical body to discuss it. Where are these migrant workers from Jamaica, from Mexico? Who is reaching them? What's happening to them? What benefits and services and protections do they have? That was another group. Homeless persons in Nova Scotia, homelessness spiked. And as the winter approaches, more and more we are hearing stories on the radio about homelessness and the need for more shelter solutions. COVID-19 has produced now another level of complexity. So even existing shelters for homeless people can no longer carry the number of people because of the requirement for social distancing. So as the winter, as it gets colder and colder, and more people are on the streets, these issues are there. And then the elderly in long-term care homes. At one point in Nova Scotia, half of the people who tested positive for COVID-19 were from one long-term care home. And this has been an area that is of concern in many places in Canada. Now, I need to say that Nova Scotia and the Atlantic provinces have some of the lowest rates of COVID-19 in Canada. So I'm happy to be here for a number of reasons. The response was quick, and although there are some peaks and troughs, other areas of Canada are in more critical conditions, in a more critical condition in terms of the spread of the virus in the population. Next slide, please. Having established my standpoint and a little look around the community to see not only to acknowledge my vulnerability, but also to see who were among the most vulnerable groups, then what should happen? Decisions were taken about preaching because, as I said, I now have to do a service every Sunday while the session is in place, while the semester is up. I won't say much more about the preaching, except to say that I did some thinking about that with another group of colleagues from a Canadian seminary here. My decision was to basically stick to the lectionary because I felt there is something about the discipline of the lectionary that is helpful and provides a structure. And I think in times of crisis, it is good. And also to help us to prevent us from always preaching only on our favorite passages of scripture, you know, so and to grapple with areas and perspectives of scripture that perhaps we would not so easily access. One of the things I found interesting is that using the lectionary also helped to expose another area of vulnerability, and I'm still thinking it through. During this semester, we had a lot of texts from the Exodus, and I got tired of the Exodus. It was feeling like trauma. And there was one Sunday we had an alternative for Jonah, and I just jumped on Jonah. And in thinking about it, I realized that we do need some spaces of rest. We can't just be always talking about the trauma. We have to take a Shabbat from the problem. It may be in the form of lament. It may be in the form of arguing with God. And in our ancestral traditions, humor, music. These are some of the tools. So I was really just tired of, you know, Moses and these crazy people and all of this talk about enslavement. And it was just such a relief in grappling with Jonah and the humor of Jonah, you know, all of the humor involved in this. And I think it exposed one of the areas of vulnerability that perhaps I was getting a little traumatized. And the coming to Jonah helped me to realize there are more than one. There are a number of ways that we have, a number of tools we have to deal with serious situations, part of which is humor. The spiritual care of students and the campus community has been of importance. I would say for the campus community, because of COVID-19, I don't know that anybody really had a break over the summer, because immediately responses had to be made to the students from the end of last semester. Faculty and students had to quickly adjust to changing assessment. How do we get to the end of the semester? Then, because there was the option and many of the courses had to be online, then a lot of the summer was spent converting courses to online formats and all of what was involved in this, plus dealing with the welfare needs and extra levels of stress, the lack of ability for some colleagues who would normally have done research in the summer to pursue that research. And of course, the travel restrictions, everybody was just under this COVID pressure. How do we have those conversations? And is anything that I'm doing of relevance and of use to people in the community? And then with the spiritual care of the students, the choir director and I worked on getting material to put up online over the summer. Reflections, music, because apart from COVID-19, a number of the students had also lost the opportunities for summer jobs. So they were at home with a lot of time hanging on their hands and without the means to make even a little money to help with their fees and their expenses for the next semester. And then as we came back to campus, we established a rhythm of Sunday worship, daily prayer, weekly Bible study, virtually up until Thanksgiving. And then we're doing some of them by hybrid at this point, looking at the topics for these. So we looked first at a series coping with COVID-19. And now we are doing a series with some Advent themes. Expecting something awesome is what I call it. Where is hope in this, and how can we hold on to hope in the midst of this? There are relationships in terms of town and gown and chapel. How do we link with the community and with the shared vulnerability? There are students who rent accommodation from people within the community. The students are patrons at businesses in the community. And as a Nova Scotian community and as an Atlantic community, we had what was the worst mass shooting in Canadian history in April of this year. So on top of the COVID-19, which hit us by March, nobody could understand how a man could move from small village to small village and kill 22 people. So all of these levels of trauma and of distress were among the things we had to think about. And as a clergy community and ecumenical community, we developed a vigil, which we put online to pray for everyone, including the shooter. And that was another very interesting discussion. The issue of self-care is one that one has had to think about. And one of the things I've found with COVID-19 is that it has spawned a deluge of webinars, so I find that a number of people and groups are calling, both within the university and outside. So there were lots. At first I went on these webinars for chaplains, and then I said, I really don't have time to do this every week. This is one activity. So how do you take care of yourself, keep in conversation, do what needs to be done, but not be over anxious? And I'll be interested to hear what you have felt. But I felt a sense of overactivity that I think has a little anxiety underneath it. And I've tried to figure out, how do I take care of myself? How do I keep up with what is happening? How do I provide spiritual care and all of the other things involved in ministry? And how do I take my Shabbat at points in time and at base understand that God is in charge, and I don't have to put my hand in every dike, every hole in every dike that's leaking. It's difficult because we are in a context, I think, of very anxious discussions, of a lot of fear, including because of the political situation in the United States and the real problems that people are having in COVID-19. Next slide. So in terms of the theologies, you won't be surprised, and I'm giving you some glimpses. We have a lovely botanical gardens as part of the university, the Irving Botanical Gardens. So some of the beautiful nature pictures you are seeing are from the gardens on the campus. And I hope that it will also give you some pleasure to look at something beautiful while we are dealing with these deep topics. So the business of the Shabbat is part of what one of the things that start at the bottom of the list in a way. On All Saints' Day, we did a memorial service, and part of what I prayed for was just a Shabbat for people who were grieving, because the grief has been really complicated for a lot of us who have lost loved ones and colleagues. My last count between last year and this year, I have lost about 27 people that I knew well. I think for the United Church, it's about 4 colleagues. If Roger can remind me, that's just colleagues in one denomination. We lost about 4. So friends, family, colleagues, that was my list. and we couldn't go home for funerals, all the rituals that would help us. Normally that wasn't there. So part of my prayer for that, All Saints Day, I did a memorial service with a memory bowl where I invited members of the community to send the names of loved ones who had died. And I got the names individually out and put them in a bowl. And part of it was a ritual of remembrance. And part of my prayer was for rest from the grief, you know, that people would just find some spaces of rest. I also found that the communion of saints and the African tradition of ancestors were very important spaces for me. At first, I was really freaking out, trying to preach a sermon to an empty chapel. The first 2 times were very bad. It felt like anxiety attacks. It just felt crazy. And one of my colleagues said to me, "But you are not alone. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses." So was her advice. When you go to preach, recognize the cloud of witnesses that's there with you. And that for me was very helpful, not only in the physical act of preaching, but in the identification of which ancestors would be my companions for the sermons and for the work I was doing. I found Bonhoeffer very relevant. I found Martin Luther King Jr. relevant. I found Brueggemann, and I'm still into Brueggemann. There's a book he just put out on the pandemic, which is nice, and it's small, so it's even better. But I also found that for lament, it was the African American spirituals that could get to some deep places and express the lament, like Aretha Franklin, "Oh Mary, Oh Martha," or dances by the Alvin Ailey Dance Company and Jamaican musicians and dancers, that somehow that ancestral tradition of music and dance to provide resilience in enslavement, segregation, and the ongoing racism gave voice to the depth of lament that I and others were experiencing and continue to experience in this time. The idea of the kingdom of God has been very, very important as a focus. Where are we? What is this all about? Where are we going? And how can we identify signs that the kingdom has already started to break in, even as we wait for the fullness? I am excited by the young people, those young people out for Black Lives Matter, the indigenous young people who are calling for justice for missing and murdered indigenous women. It's the young people in the World Council of Churches who are looking at mental health in the time of pandemic. There are many signs, but perhaps the signs of the kingdom don't make as much noise as the death-dealing forces. And I feel part of our role as Christians here now is to proclaim the kingdom and say it is here among us and within us now, and to hold up those signs as part of the hope. And fullness of life, that Jesus did come to bring life and life in all its fullness, and to embody that and to help to give it visibility, and to help as we work together to identify where the vulnerable are showing us the way to this fullness of life. Next slide, thanks. You have to help me with the time. I'm feeling I'm almost there. And then fostering partnership. I'll start this section by saying I have been a beneficiary of the ecumenical movement. In my formation as a young person in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and they did ordain me for their sins. The Disciples of Christ is ecumenical in its DNA, but also through the Caribbean Conference of Churches, which had a vibrant ecumenical youth movement, and the United Theological College of the West Indies, where I went for training middle to the end of the 1970s, at a point where Caribbean theology was at its most exciting, or at a very exciting milestone. And a number of the seminal writers of Caribbean theology of the time were our lecturers. So I have been a beneficiary of this. And this ecumenical engagement has given me substance to pull on as I try to examine what is happening and to function. So I thought about things like spiritual communion. What is spiritual communion? You know, what about those churches that don't have communion? Know that we don't have communion. What can we learn from that? And suddenly baptism, Eucharist, and ministry is not looking, you know, like something on a shelf. But know that people can't come to communion, and know that for traditions where only the priest is supposed to be to consecrate the sacraments, what happens when we can't come? What new conversations can we have about communion? What's community? What's the body of Christ when we have to meet virtually? What does that mean? What's prayer? These are some of the conversations that I found very interesting. And what to do about events in the United States. I was called by a radio station in Jamaica and asked what should happen to the president, and what was the theological stance in terms of how do we cope with this situation. And so all of these partnerships are there. I'll share one other memory with you. Some years ago, I was part of a group of people through the interfaith section of the World Council of Churches. We were having a meeting in Egypt, and we went to a Greek Orthodox church. First of all, we had to go down some little back alleys to this Greek Orthodox church. Practically no congregation. There was one other person in the congregation apart from the Greek Orthodox church. The priests. So there was the archbishop and the priests, very elaborate ceremony, all the vestments, you know, they were having mass, all of the rituals around the iconostasis. And I'm saying to myself, but there is no congregation. But now that I have to preach to an empty church, to preach to an empty building, this kind of idea of the representative nature of what the priest does, say in an Orthodox tradition, that's important, even if the person is not there, of the preserving of a sacred space, even if the building is not full. What does this mean to, you know, my Protestant upbringing? And I am grateful for these experiences through the World Council of Churches, the Caribbean Conference of Churches, that open us up to other experiences, not just discussion, but the experience of sitting in a church where almost nobody worships, but the priests and the archbishop are faithfully coming to celebrate the Mass, whether anybody is there, because this is a sacred space. So those are some of the gifts, I think, of the ecumenical movement, and memories and experiences that I have been able to draw on. And of course, structured and ad hoc conversations with colleagues. And one of the joys of the technology is that we can be talking all over the world, which I do. In terms of my work with the students, that all of this experience has informed that work, and therefore building the team and the capacity of the chapel assistants who are students has been a priority for me. What do they think? How do they think we should respond? Is contemplative prayer relevant? So I've been exposing them to different forms of contemplative prayer, which help us to be alone without being lonely or frightened. I don't know yet what they'll make of it, but we're pressing on. Collaboration with other colleagues in the university. How do we deal with loneliness? How do we deal with Zoom fatigue? You know, I'm feeling a little zoomed out. The students are even more zoomed out because they could be for most of their day having lessons on Zoom. So how do we support them? How do we create spaces for them? How do we identify who are the ones who are in trouble and what's relevant to help them? And how do we make the best use of the opportunities that we do have for physically distant spaces to help them to maintain connection with each other in safe ways? And I have also had to make decisions about what I can do, what I can do not at all, and what I can do peripherally. So unfortunately, as much as I would like to be doing more about the migrant farm workers, I can't do that now. Does prayer make any sense if we pray for them, or if we talk about it as clergy colleagues and we say, well, maybe we need to do a little bit more research and to think about it? What can be done? How can I work with others, particularly around areas of mental health? That's a big thing for everybody in COVID-19, and particularly for students who are away from home. What should be on the to-do list? And perhaps I'd add what should be on the to-be list. I don't have the answers, but these are questions that I struggle with. And so in closing, I will say that, next slide. This has been a place of personal vulnerability for, I think, lots of people in the world. My approach has been to draw on some of the classic strategies of praxis to center myself in the preferential option for the poor, both the poor and the neglected within, as well as the poor and the neglected in the community, to observe, to listen, to reflect theologically, contemplatively, alone and in community and in interdisciplinary spaces, to act, and of course to be doing this cycle over and over again. So thank you.
Round of applause, please. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis. Thank you for your passionate and articulate voice as chaplain, spiritual leader, and theologian. You know, I myself also serve my school as a chaplain. So you should come and visit my school and speak to my own students after this COVID-19. And since we are behind the schedule because Dr. Lewis, you have spent double of your time. So, but we enjoyed your presentation. Rather than making a kind of response to your presentation, I'd like to ask a short question so that we can open a Q&A session for everybody. You have named and embraced your own vulnerability, and also you have identified those who are vulnerable today. This reminds me of the idea of the theological idea of the vulnerable God, not almighty, strong dictator God, but vulnerable God. God is vulnerable and God became vulnerable. So my question is short. How can the vulnerable God help us in the midst of COVID-19? How does our vulnerable God foster partnership with those who are vulnerable among us in the midst of COVID-19? Let me raise this short theological question to you, and if you can make a response. And then the Q&A is open to everybody. You should follow. You should raise your own question directly to Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. This is precisely an important link. And I think in looking at Christology at a time like this, then the question of the humanity of Jesus is an important place. The Jesus who was born in humble circumstances, the Jesus who wept at the death of his friend Lazarus, the Jesus who was crucified outside the city wall, who suffered, who was tortured, who died, but who testifies that we can live again. So for me, these are important places, the places of vulnerability, of where this solidarity. It's interesting that the gospel reading for this Sunday is that parable of the sheep and the goats. When did I see you? When did I see you? For as much as you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. So I think the vulnerability of Jesus and Jesus as companion are some of the points at which, like the Emmaus Road walk, that humanity of Jesus and that incarnated solidarity. I think those are some of the places where the vulnerable God in the human Jesus, the womanist would say, the Black woman's Jesus, who is human and who understands suffering. That for me is a key part of the vulnerability that I find relevant at this time.
Thank you so much. Okay, now the floor is open to everybody, so you can raise your question directly to Dr. Ruiz, and she will respond and entertain your question. Okay.
Maybe you can unlock yourself if you want to ask some question, please. I mean, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would be happy to hear comments too, because I'm hoping we can have
please.
something of a dialogue. And I would want to know what's happening with you where you are, and what are the resources what theologies are relevant as for you in this context, and what partnerships are life-giving in this time, if I may.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. It's Angelique. It's an honor to, I'm really pushed in this moment because we have our Pan-African Women of Faith and Pauline 2-day conference, and we just came off of the morning webinar. It was just very energizing. You talk about what's giving you energy, and clearly living in this moment with the women around the world of Pan-African identity is certainly life-giving. And you've been a part of that. And I get to say, yay, thank you for being a part of that movement. So I didn't hear all of the beginning of your remarks, but I did come in a very timely way around you were thinking about lament, and remembering that when we walk into those physical spaces that appear by sight, at least visibly, are not really what's going on. You know, that is the ancestors who are always with us, the great cloud of witnesses. And I just think so many pastors need to remember that. You know, it's not only the Holy Spirit, but the great cloud of witnesses. We are like crowded by those who've gone before us. Our theme for the women, Pan-African Women's Conference retreat and the webinar this morning was around the ancestors and living in the spirit of Sankofa. All things in this moment, right? We are the embodiment of this moment, the past, the future, and this moment, Ubuntu in Sankofa moment. And so to hear you talk about that in this season of lament, and particularly for us, those in the diaspora in the United States, in the Black Lives Matter movement, being out with the protests, being in this space of reframing, it's like reframing is happening like every other moment. Sometimes it feels like, especially when you're walking closely with younger generations in this moment. But to say that, yeah, all of us need Shabbat, but also the engagement. I remember when I interviewed Archbishop Desmond Tutu on my TV program years ago, he said, you must have a rhythm, retreat and engage, retreat and engage. And I've really tried to walk in that spirit. So I did hear you say that as well in your remarks. And I can't celebrate that enough. It's particularly of those like us who are so passionately called in to do scholarship, but also engage it. So I just want to thank you as usual. What I did hear was your usual substantive self, and God bless you for that. We look up to you in many ways and thank God for you.
Thank you. Great to connect with you again this morning, Angelique.
Dr. Lewis, here's a question from Victoria Turner. Let me read the question for you. I wonder if you could elaborate a little more about the situation between the university and indigenous people in your context. In my university in the area, a student from Nova Scotia was really upset about the attack and reacted by doing traditional practices, such as playing the bagpipes. He's also a Celtic studies student. But it made me wonder about perhaps conflicting identities between communities there, and how has COVID impacted relations?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, the relationships, I think, as most places, are complex. I think policy framework and legislation and financial allocation are important marks of seriousness. So in Canada, you have an overarching calls to action coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission some years ago, and particularly institutions that were involved in residential schools. There is actually a listing. You can find the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action online. But all the main institutions have listed practical steps that they're supposed to take. That's the first thing. So for example, the seminaries associated with religious groups that had residential schools, one of the things they are supposed to do is to have courses on indigenous culture and spirituality. And I was fortunate to attend one of those courses while I've been here. So that's the first thing. In terms of the university itself, so that acknowledges that racism, deprivation of land, all of those things happened. It's not over, but you have to have some kind of framework. I think it's much more difficult if there is not a policy decision and legislation that you can call on. For the university, I am coming at a time where they have been doing intentional work for some time. So there was first, some years ago, a committee that was set up to look at decolonization at the university. And out of that decolonization committee came decisions about the setting up of specific work for indigenous people and for Black people on the campus. So if you go to Acadia University, you will see there is a whole indigenous center. There are formal arrangements made with the Mi'kmaq Elders Council, and full-time staff and part-time staff to work with indigenous students directly and to keep up the advocacy throughout the university on behalf of indigenous students. Then they went on to hire a Black student advisor, and lots of things are happening a little fast for me. By August of this year, no, they asked, the president decided on a task force, and he said, I don't want a committee, I want a task force, because I want concrete recommendations as to how the university can have a more far-reaching anti-racist ethos and experience, not just the words. So the other co-chair is a community person whose expertise is in education for Black young people, and the deputy chair is the head of the Indigenous Center. So right at the heart of this is the kind of where we have the biggest issues, which is with anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. So I think as we learned through the women's movement, just to hire a person doesn't cut it. What we need is to mainstream it. So you have to look at curriculum, for argument's sake. You have to look at who you're hiring, and that's the way the university is going. There are major conflicts. There was a major blow up among lobster fishermen, indigenous and settler fishermen. So it's not over, and it's ongoing. But I really feel legislation, policy frameworks, and allocation of resources are important frameworks within which now we do the individual work, and also for people to understand the structural nature of racism and often the unconscious nature of racism. So that's part of what is happening here, but there are issues. I think racism is just everywhere, but these are some of the planks.
Thank you. It seems to me,
Yeah.
Have it?
Yeah, can I? Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Really appreciate those key points raised in your presentation. A quick point here, if you could develop this a bit further. In relation to this changing landscape with COVID-19 and how that impacts on what it means to be in relationship, ecumenical relationship. I'd like to put two signposts that I think I'd love to hear some further comments from you there. I think what I heard from you was that we're in a liminal space. We're caught in between. And that kind of an in-between environment and how one lives is most disconcerting in terms of finding certainty as to how one acts, behaves. And I think another key word that jumps out at me when I listened to your presentation, although you did not use the term itself theologically, yet it jumped out at me, is that we have to learn much more how to deal with the end. You know? Yeah, how we are in the apocalypse, as it were, in different ways, personally, with our friends, with our job, with our whatever. We must embrace apocalypse as a type of lifestyle. And let me stop there. That's my initial reflection on some of the points I heard from you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Hewitt. I think it's a combination of liminal and the watery chaos of Genesis, because the word chaos has been used a lot, especially in relation to the United States, to matters in the United States. And there is a Canadian writer, Melanie Klein, whose work I find interesting. She's a journalist, but she has been writing for some time now, on what she calls a shock doctrine and the manipulation of anxiety and shocks, whether manufactured by rhetoric and policies and action of people, or whether there are those who are opportunistic with whatever disaster comes, whether it's a natural disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake. So one of the examples she gave was that there were some people who made a lot of money after Katrina because they profited, they had the cash to buy up people's property when they were afraid, you know. So I think part of it is that maybe the apocalypse is not a dystopian future. Maybe it is the watery chaos, and the Spirit of God is brooding over it, right? And that light, life, and order will come out of it. The liminality, I think, is the aspect of it that I feel strongest now, is the fact that we all have to confront the uncertainty of life, the uncertainties, and how much out of control we are. Because there's a lot of psychologists are dealing with trauma lenses for what's happening to us with COVID. But unlike a traumatic event, this is not a critical event, that it's a disaster, it comes, or a typhoon, it comes, it goes, you pick up the pieces and you go with it. We don't know when it will end. So it's not only traumatic, but we can't see the end. And I think that there's a liminality between jobs, say, that you say, okay, I will get a job. You know, I'll apply for a job and it's likely I'll get a job. But when the whole world is in a place where you have no idea what is going to come next, then I think that gives an existential, a level of existential angst, that it's our job. This is where theology is important. And it's interesting that in some churches have been reporting that lots more people are joining them online than would normally come into the sanctuary, because now people are asking questions that are existential questions. What is life? What's the meaning? What if I have no power? What if I have no work? You know, so I think we need to claim what we have been saying with a little confidence, not arrogance, but to be available as servants to help people to grapple with the existential stuff that's in your face right now. You're out of control. And even if a vaccine comes, we're all not going to get it by the end of next year. That's the reality. And then there are the ethical questions. I mean, I am of the view that ethics is probably the single most important subject right now. So at what price will the vaccine be sold? Who will get it first? What's happening to the moral injury? I heard one doctor saying, look, when I was in this was a doctor from the States, when I was in medical school, nobody told me that I might have to choose among my patients which one will get the ventilator, because it's just too many, you know. So how do I as a physician deal with this? So I think there is a space for us, and it's a creative space, and the liminality is linked to these key existential issues, which normally is mainly the dying that we deal with this. You know, when you go on a hospital visit, very often people who weren't paying attention to these things now are open for deep conversations. But no, I think public theology, there are lots of people who are grappling and who may want to engage the conversation, but maybe not in the language of us church insiders. So that's the other thing. What's the language with which to engage the public with the existential angst that is so widespread now? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Lewis, Victoria Turner expressed her thanks for your very interesting answer. Okay, is there any other questions or comments? Okay, Hee-kyung, you are, yeah, I saw you raising your hands. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, wait a moment.
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Lewis, thank you for your insightful seminar. It's been an honor to see you again since 2018. I was a participant of the DCSW, so I met you in Kingston in Jamaica, and as an international, yes, and as an international student living in foreign country in this moment, I felt so much full of consolation. Consolation from your lecture because I can name and embrace my vulnerability in here. So thank you again. And as you just mentioned, the significant role of humor and music in this moment, I just wanted to ask you if you have any suggestion to have some more, peaceful, or can we keep our resilience in this moment? Do you have any suggestions from Jamaican songs or some other meditation?
Well, two things I would say. In another kind of WhatsApp conversation with a friend on the ancestral or on ancestral heritage.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question I would ask, in your ancestry, and I mean the ancestry of your people,
Mm-hmm.
what were the tools of resilience?
Mm-hmm.
What were the rituals of resilience
Mm-hmm.
that are in your DNA?
Yeah.
That the vulnerable have embraced? I think that's the first place to start.
Okay.
Because it resonates. Shakespeare would say in your bowels, you know, deep down in your in your tummy,
Okay.
when it is coming through your ancestral line and through the things about who you are and your culture that you can't even put into words. And unfortunately, missionary Christianity back in the day has done us a disservice by demonizing a lot of the wisdom of our elders. And I think part of our job is to recover and reclaim that wisdom as part of the incarnation.
Amen.
For us, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Having said that, one of my favorite, I like Alvin Ailey Dance Company. He has a suite called Revelations. It is powerful. It's dances to spirituals. And for lament, I think the best lament piece I've heard is Mary, Don't You Weep,
Mary, Don't You Weep,
by Aretha Franklin. What she and the choirs do, you know, you're talking about groans, is that groans with the spirit groaning? The spirit is wailing. With the tears, you can't cry, with the sounds you didn't even know are in your body. So that I find really powerful. Oh Mary, Don't You Weep, by Aretha Franklin. And it's interesting theologically, right? Because she links Mary and Martha and the death of Lazarus with the Exodus. Pharaoh's army was drowned, but I won't tell you anymore. You could look it up. it's online. But I think the place to start is what is ours, what we have. The other thing for me, of course, is Jamaica, the African Jamaican traditions of kumina and so on. The dance, the drum beat and the dance help to move that stress and the pain and the trauma that's in your body. You have to move.
Yeah.
So the singing and the dancing is not just the Western epistemology that's all in your head and your intellect. The body needs to express those things. And in my African tradition, it's definitely the drums and some dances that the missionaries didn't think were proper.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I think we should dance and sing together sometime in webinar. Since I have to go to bed, I'm so sorry that I have to close this session. And I am so grateful to you, Dr. Lewis, again, for your naming the vulnerability, your embracing of the vulnerability. Yeah. And you taught us how to be partners with those who are vulnerable among us. Yeah. And you asked us to keep asking who else is vulnerable among us. This is a significant question for our transformative ecumenism today. So, Dr. Lewis, I'd like to visit your beautiful chapel.
It is.
On a snowy day, not every day. On a snowy day, you should invite me to visit there.
Yes.
And I'd like to hear more about your Nannish theology, which is womanist, Jamaican womanist theology. So everybody also wants to visit your chapel on a snowy day, but today we have to close our session. And I'd like to invite everyone to express our great, gratitude to Reverend Dr. Lewis for your passionate contribution to our session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I invite you to check out our website.
Okay.
Some of these services are online.
Okay.
I think you may be particularly interested in the Memorial Remembrance Sunday service.
Okay.
and the All Saints service, where
Excellent.
we're really now grappling with pain, with the pain of loss. Loved ones who had died, and for All Saints, for remembrance here, mainly veterans of World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. So
Those are
I
deceased.
invite you to look and give me some feedback on the Facebook page or something. I would
Okay.
really appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. So, sisters and brothers, tomorrow we have another great speech. Mr. Paul Divaka is from National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights tomorrow night here in Korean time. And also we have a third cluster of our webinar on December 2nd. Professor Heidi Campbell will speak on education, formation, and communication in virtual spaces. 3rd December by Dr. Jennifer Leaf. She will speak on nurturing transformative ecumenism at the level of people and communities. And lastly, 4th December, we'll have a closing discussion. And I have prepared a closing prayer from Reverend Tom Schumann. We have a new beatitude. I'd like to invite you all to read this Jesus' new beatitude in these times of COVID-19. Okay, shall we? Blessed are
they who
wash
wash their hands,
They shall
for
hold.
they shall hold living water.
Blessed are
Blessed are
Blessed
those
are those
who
who
keep their
their
distance,
for they
for
shall
they shall
draw
draw closer to God. Blessed are
Blessed
they
are they who
quarantine,
send to quarantine,
but they
for
shall
they
they
shall
shall
have
have
others.
blessed
Blessed
are
Blessed
are
are
those who
those
do
who do
not
not
hoard,
hold,
for they
for
shall
they shall
feed
feed
families.
families.
Blessed
Blessed
are
are
those
those
who
who
sing
sing songs
to
to
sheltering
sheltering
neighbors,
neighbors,
For they
for
shall
they
be
shall be
be
members
members of the
of the
heavenly host.
heavenly host.
blessed are
Blessed
Blessed
are
are the
parents who
who
learn
learn
how
how
to
to
teach
teach
at
at home,
home,
for
for
they shall
they
they
shall
shall
learn
learn from
from their
children.
children.
blessed
Blessed
are they
are
Blessed are
they
they
who shop
who
for
shop
older
for older
folks,
folks,
for
for
they
they
shall
shall
receive
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 everlasting
everlasting
thanks.
thanks.
blessed
Blessed are
Blessed
the
are the
frontline
frontline
health
health
workers,
workers,
for they
for
shall
they
be
they
shall
shall
be
be
called
called
healers
healers
of
of
humanity. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in this webinar tonight. And so once again, we appreciate Reverend Dr. Lewis. And I'd like to say my greetings again. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. And see you tomorrow night again. Thank you very much.